1 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Mann, and I'm an assistant professor here at Michigan State University, and I'm going to host our webinar today for the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. The title is Bringing Cooperatives Back into the Community Economic Development Toolbox. So I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today. Before we get started, I want to point out just a couple of things. One, there's a chat box below, and so we'll do all the questions and answers in the chat box. So if you'll type your questions in, when we get to the conclusion of the presentation, we'll read through those. Keith will read through those, and he'll respond to those. He'll use his mic to respond to those, but you can only ask the questions via the chat box. Also, we are recording this webinar. And so the webinar recording will be available on the NCRCRD webpage in the next few days. So today our presenter is Dr. Keith Taylor. He's a community economic development specialist at the University of California at Davis, and he's going to share some more about his work with cooperatives and economic development. So Keith, go ahead and take it away.
Sure, thanks, John. Yeah, hello everybody. It's Keith Taylor here. Part of the impetus behind this presentation is I'm wanting to give folks an extension to think more about how we can engage with community-based enterprise. A lot of the way that we've been doing community economic development, I think, is sort of limiting in the community economic development impacts. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what some of the problems are with how we've been doing this from kind of a dominant perspective, and then how this alternative isn't really so much an alternative, so much as something latent waiting for us to tap into. So with that, I will go ahead and begin. I will show you on this first slide here. I thought it would be a great thing to show this infographic. It's a comparison in Davis, California, where I'm based, between a market-based rental unit and a limited equity housing cooperative unit. This infographic really shows you, when you engage with these alternative models, what kind of savings the day-to-day consumer can see when they use these things. So an example is this market-based rental unit, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in Davis is going to go for about $2,600 a month. This limited equity housing cooperative that you see here, it's going for around $1,200 a month. So the savings are pretty significant. That's something we could talk about later. But what I want to do is hop right in and talk about some of the problems that we have with the current modes of economic development. What you see here are 2 smokestacks. This is symbolic of how we've gone about economic development, this idea of smokestack chasing. If we want to create jobs in our local community, we're going to go out and seek a big company to come in and build a factory. And with that, they'll create upwards of 1,500 jobs in some instances. You're seeing that today with the announcement of Amazon and its HQ2 headquarters. They're receiving enormous subsidies. I think in Long Island, they're getting $50,000 per job they're going to be creating. So the question is this a really good idea for us to be putting our public dollars into these private enterprise that are making billions of dollars in profits? The classic approach has these general features. You could call it smokestack chasing, but also in Silicon Valley, they call it unicorn chasing. The idea is we're out there looking for unicorns, and rarely do you actually find one. But if you do, then that's an amazing thing. So you have your hopes and aspirations up, but the reality is the payoff in these is rare, if ever. Also, what we see too in how we do economic development, we think about technological solutions. If we just find that one technology to take care of a problem that we all face, then that's going to have this economic spillover effect. So things like farm automation is really on the tip of people's tongues right now in a place like California. But let's face it, when you do the automation, what's going to happen is you're going to make it easier for already large landowners to get even larger, and they're going to carve off more of their workforce. So you're going to develop more inequity in the economy there. But then, going back to Amazon HQ2, there's these public pledges from these recipients of economic development. They claim they're going to do all this wonderful stuff. Uh, but the studies are coming out are showing that it's just the opposite. In many instances, these enterprises are actually harming their local communities, or at least keeping other vital enterprises from being financed. So, some of the challenges that we see that we're facing as in extension, but also dealing with our stakeholders in economic development, we're seeing this hollowing out of the middle class, declining home ownership. We're seeing a 1099 gig economy, so people have less and less job security, and with that, they have to pay more and more taxes whenever they sign on to the gig economy, working for places like Uber, for example. Another example on this would be folks talking about how great Airbnb is. The idea that you would monetize a place that you live, your home, in order to let a stranger stay there. To me, this is an example of just how desperate people are to have a side residual income outside their normal salary. There's also this real big problem on the horizon of declining small business entrepreneurship. Uh, you're seeing rural communities where the mom and pa enterprises just aren't able to survive. Amazon is out competing them. In some instances, you just have a smaller consumer base in order to support them. And then with that, you're seeing increasing household debt and declining household wealth. Uh, I can tell you that as a recent university graduate, it's difficult when you get out with a lot of student loan debt and you don't have much in savings. This is endemic. Next slide. And then, there's this question of, are we seeing intergenerational economic warfare? Uh, we're seeing where the current recipient generation of pensions are receiving their full allotment, but in many ways, those pensions seem to have been inflated. And now what we're doing is we're subsidizing them on the backs of the younger generation that's coming in and paying into that system. So even pension systems going forward are either going to not pay out as much as they used to, or they're going to be not enough to live on. And there's also this challenge of decreasing civic participation. Where are the laboratories of democracy that we were told in our early civics classes existed everywhere in the United States? I think about the 2012 presidential election uh, as a great example of how we've carved off how we view civic engagement. So you had Mitt Romney famously talk about the job creators, that our policies should be addressing them. And Obama, looking more egalitarian, would talk about the workforce. But never in any of this was there a discussion of civics, of the citizenry, of the public entrepreneurs and people trying to impact the public good. So our mental models, our way of looking at these things were quite narrowed. Now, these features of economic development policy, uh, let's just go over this briefly. Who is excluded and what is lost? The way that we operate right now is the system is relatively inequitable. Whenever we give a large subsidy, uh, there's no sharing in the spoils. So if these companies make large profits, that's great for them. But there's no guarantee that those profits are going to spill over into the community. In fact, their shareholders are probably going to say they're being irresponsible if they're not capturing every last bit of profit. Additionally, there's no governance rights. Whenever we go out and we attract capital to come into our communities and they build these new enterprises, we don't necessarily have a seat at the table to tell these companies how to operate. Now, if it would be a local enterprise, the beauty of that is you run into folks at your local grocery store or your church, but not necessarily with absentee owned firms. The question there is, are these folks accountable to the local needs? And what if they don't meet up to their expectations if they receive these subsidies? Is there a clawback provision? Companies like Tesla and their Gigafactory in Reno have not delivered on the jobs they promised, but we're not holding them accountable for not meeting up with their promises. Additionally, there's this outflow of collective wealth in how we're doing these things. So we essentially have this fire hose model of investment that's Amazon is used, where Amazon comes out and says, if you just throw money at us over and over again, we will eventually get to a scale where we'll outcompete everybody. Um, your public goods are being put into this, though. Many of these investors come from the pension systems and foundations and whatnot. And this is done in a way that undermines local enterprise. So, how do we go about creating this equity? Uh, what can we do to enhance public entrepreneurship to root wealth and development locally? This is something that I think is very much out of the mainstream political discussion, but it's not foreign to how we've discussed economic development in the past. And furthermore, how do we go beyond just one-off economic development? Um, you know, the whenever we do find a really great outlier of community economic development, oftentimes it doesn't scale. What can we do to identify these ways to scale so that way these local community-based enterprise can compete at the local and national level? And then further, what about capital? Capital is always a big discussion in this. Here it is, a lot of our local economic development institutions are giving money or just putting it on the table with an Amazon. And yet our local entrepreneurs, they say all they need is a couple $10,000 or whatever in order to start their local enterprise. And yet that money is not directed toward them. Their local tax dollars are going to their local economic development institute or center, and it's being used to attract or retain big corporations. Uh, you know, so what this means is in our community economic development toolbox, we have all of these tools, and yet we only keep on picking up the hammer at the end of this. Uh, we think this one-size-fits-all approach is going to be what saves our communities, but we've seen time and time again that this attraction and retention approach just isn't paying the dividends that's been promised. So in extension, I think we can be this vehicle for delivering new community economic development strategies. There's a lot of wonderful examples out there, and I'm going to touch on a few of them in this conversation. Some of the approaches that are out there that I think are wonderful and have been talked about, these sort of alternative economies arenas, things like rooting wealth. And this wealth rooting model is really coming out of the Democracy Collaborative. If you've heard the Democracy Collaborative, it's probably because of their work in Cleveland, where what they've been doing is working with anchor institutions, things such as hospitals and museums, these institutions that aren't going away. And instead of contracting out to Sodexo Marriott for laundry services or something like this, can we create a local enterprise where the ownership is also by the stakeholders themselves? And through that, do we get this enhanced economic multiplier effect? So in Cleveland, they've created 3 worker cooperatives that are both doing quite well at this point. One is an industrial laundromat. Another is, I believe, the world's largest inner city greenhouse. And another is a solar company. These groups are all worker owned as a cooperative, and they are bound together in a federation. They just announced this morning that they are creating a fund to help go out and purchase businesses, which kind of goes into another aspect, saving local enterprise. So imagine if we could take these approaches to developing cooperatives and you link up with this community-based enterprise as well, the traditional approaches, ma or sole proprietorships and whatnot. Instead of letting those businesses wither on the vine, we have the staff buy them out. So there's ways that you can do this. Again, the Democracy Collaborative has recently created a fund, but there's examples such as the Isle Cooperative in Maine, where a husband and wife owned a series of retail outlets. They needed to retire, and instead of just letting the business go under, they sold it to the staff. And the staff have converted the hardware store, the gas station, and grocery store to a cooperative. Now these businesses are going to stay in the community and are going to be run by the very people who have a very strong stake in its success. The next question with that is oftentimes we know that the folks that would buy these out aren't necessarily qualified to run them. And that's a really difficult thing to acknowledge. But that said, we have these wonderful entities behind the scenes. We have purchasing cooperatives and buying groups that exist. And what they allow you to do is provide management expertise, but also purchasing at scale behind the scenes. So when you see your local Ace Hardware store, It is independently owned. However, behind the scenes, it's part of a major purchasing cooperative that allows your local store to compete head on against Home Depot and even Amazon. So, in my work, I'm very much dedicated to focusing on cooperatives. Cooperatives are the sleeping giant that have not been utilized in our community economic development work for decades now, which is really unfortunate considering Extension had used cooperatives back in the day. The cooperative sector is no fluke either. It is quite significant in the US. There's over 37,000 of these firms. They employ tens of thousands of people in high paying jobs. There's trillions of dollars of turnover that go through there. And we can go into detail in the question and A on the various sectors. Now, the reason why this matters is cooperatives are predicated on these 7 principles. And these principles are enshrined to some extent into law. So it guarantees that those folks that use cooperatives have a voice in making sure the cooperative meets their local needs. Additionally, for us in Extension and who are interested in economic development, these 3 features of cooperation amongst co-ops, concern for community, and education and training are really powerful tools. Instead of Extension providing all of these services, imagine if we had tighter knit connections to our cooperatives to grow more co-ops. So that way we're not the only ones doing economic development. We're doing these with community partners. But also these co-ops in their expression of concern for community help to develop that community enterprise while also connecting small businesses to purchasing cooperatives and other such things. And on the education side, cooperatives could be these powerful laboratories for teaching civics and public entrepreneurship. They are already. However, they're not telling that story. And I don't think that any of it has to do with anything nefarious. I just believe they've been in a hyper competitive environment and a lot has been taken for granted. We in Extension could be the conveners to help remind many of these cooperatives about their public role. So there's so much that these cooperatives do right now that can help Extension with addressing a number of wicked problems. So in utilities in California, with the wildfires we're experiencing right now, oftentimes PG&E, the investor-owned utility, is fingered for being responsible for this. This public utility here in California has not been investing in its wildfire mitigation. But when you know about the electric cooperatives throughout the rural parts of the United States, now you have an alternative. So when the investor owns fail, we can bring the cooperatives to the table and say, maybe we need to be looking at a conversion opportunity, something that's going to invest more in the public good. These electric cooperatives, by the way, encompass about 57% of the rural American landmass. And there's $42 billion a year of revenue that goes through that sector. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Additionally, with utilities, there's a lot of issues with rural broadband. The rural electric co-ops could be very strong partners in helping expand rural broadband. Water systems are another issue. Unfortunately, many individuals in rural water systems do not know about purchasing co-ops and associations that are helping water systems out. So this allows these water systems to attain new knowledge, but also to achieve economies of scale to make their scarce resources go further. Also in the arena of food systems and food accessibility, there is a very vibrant food co-op sector. And earlier when I mentioned housing, we talk a lot about creating affordable housing. Rent control has been a very relevant issue in California lately. But a lot of these are kind of sub policies that are in search of a larger macro policy. We need to have a more comprehensive housing policy that seeks to leverage these policies in order to move housing into kind of collective ownership. In places like Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, these are very expensive places to live. And yet individuals that are born and raised there stay there in those nations. And a big part of the reason why is housing is affordable. they have a significant housing cooperative sector. This is something that is absolutely absent in public policy and economic development in the United States. So I just want to give you an example of some of the various co-op brands that are out there that you've all seen. Obviously, REI is a massive one. Cabot Cheeses. Pachamama is a wonderful example of how to do international ag. In Pachamama, the coffee farmers themselves own the supply chain. So, the pretty remarkable story there. Organic Valley is also another wonderful cooperative out of Wisconsin. They have a national footprint, though. They're doing just great things. So, one of the things I'm sure that many are asking then is how do you go about developing cooperatives? They seem, those of you that have been involved with food cooperatives know that it can be a very difficult thing to get involved in. And absolutely, it can be challenging to start these cooperatives off. Part of it is that we're behind the curve in the United States. We used to have very strong co-op development support systems in which sector by sector they had an entity that helped to kind of turnkey start cooperatives. If you look at a lot of our European compatriots, they've got these enduring systems set up, and they're still growing their cooperatives. So we'll talk about that. The first example I want to give, though, on how to start these, we should be engaging philanthropy first. There's this amazing story with the American credit union sector. Credit unions in the United States comprise 11% of consumer finance. What a lot of individuals don't know is that the credit union sector started up largely due to the philanthropy of Edward Filene. Filene, if you're from the Northeast, ran the Filene's Basement retail stores. In 1908, he grew frustrated with the loan sharks taking advantage of his staff. Filene was very dedicated to making sure his staff was well compensated. He even offered to allow them to unionize and to buy out the company, but they refused because they didn't want to run it and they thought he did a fine job himself. So Filene turned to other ways that he could help his staff. And then as travels around the world, he got exposed to the banking cooperative model in India, Germany, and Canada. He wanted to bring it to the United States. And so what he did was he worked on this interesting approach where he would go state by state to develop co-ops, to develop these credit unions. And as they hit a critical mass, he would put pressure on the state legislature to create state cooperative statutes around credit unions. His idea was you'd hit a certain point where you'd have a federal credit union law, which occurred, I believe, it was either 1934 or 1935. Filene put $1 million of his own money into a bureau that went out into these communities across the United States to help folks start credit unions. From 1908 to 1937, him and his team helped create over 5,000 credit unions in the United States. He passes away in 1937, and his right-hand man, Bergengren, takes over. And up till 1948, they create an additional 21,000 credit unions in the United States. Absolutely remarkable story of philanthropy that is not told in our business schools. Now, just an example here of the kind of scale of these credit unions, this image that I have on this slide is of the Golden One Arena in Sacramento. The Golden One Arena is named after Golden One Credit Union. They have a 20-year naming agreement that costs $20 million. One wonders if this credit union is also using $20 million for anti-poverty programming. But what this is to say is, if we kind of remove our cynical lens here, these credit unions have enormous capacity to engage in localized community economic development. And virtually everyone has a credit union in their community. A model of self-help collective action comes out of Italy. The Italian cooperatives saw the writing on the wall back in the 1970s. They realized that they were a very robust movement, but they had to start working together on larger scale policy. So they came together and they said, we need to invest in ourselves, really reinforce the cooperative principles of cooperation amongst co-ops, but also we need to have the public policy that supports us. So what the co-ops did is they started a strategy of very strong federated structures. They put a lot of power in their centralized coordinating bodies. They then would make sure that the loans would go through those federations. They also dug deep into the member networks to reinforce that bond that consumers have with their cooperatives. People were able, whenever you go to a grocery cooperative in Italy during this time, if you check, whenever you checked out, they would ask you if you wanted to invest in your cooperative. So this was the early days of Kickstarter almost. Individuals were able to do member loans or grants to the co-op. The co-op sector in Italy grew massively from the 1970s to 1990s. It's still on a relatively positive growth trajectory to this day. But one of the other aspects of this co-op sector that's pretty remarkable is they levied to have their corporate taxes diverted into a fund. So I believe that the co-ops in Italy are taxed 3% on their profits. And the fund is there for loans to grow additional cooperatives. Pretty remarkable story. Today, I believe that the grocery cooperative sector in Italy is over 50% owned by cooperatives. And in the United States, too, we shouldn't reject the idea that we have these food cooperatives that are all over the United States. I would argue that at this interesting stage where these cooperatives are relatively disparate. They're not so well connected. And if we in Extension were to convene this sector, I believe that we could convene them with our agri-foods, with our purchasing cooperatives, with our agricultural cooperatives, and help to develop a strategy of community-owned food systems. There's over 300 of these food cooperatives. They're doing over 2.2 billion in collective revenue. And not to mention the agricultural cooperatives are just enormous in the US as well. So right now, this is a missed opportunity that I think that Extension should be engaging with. Another one that might be more familiar to a lot of folks in Extension is what happened with the electric cooperatives. During the New Deal era, you're facing the Great Depression. Roosevelt wanted to bring electricity to the rural countryside. A lot of folks think that the creation of the Rural Electrification Act was intended to empower the development of rural electric cooperatives. But actually, what occurred was Roosevelt had initially convened the investor-owned firms, and he offered them enormous subsidies in order to go into rural America. The problem was that rural America wasn't profitable enough. These investor-owned utilities absolutely could have made a profit off of this, but they wanted more like 4 to 12% profits, not 1 to 3%. They wanted to stay in their urban enclaves where they could extract more per mile of line. So Roosevelt, just absolutely outraged at the greed of these investor-owned firms, developed the Rural Electrification Act, which worked with USDA and local farm bureaus to organize rural residents to develop the electric cooperative sector. This sector today, the legacy is absolutely remarkable. And first, let me say, the spillover effect in economic development is something that's not talked about often. Once the USDA once the Rural Electrification Administration would go into these areas and help folks start their electric co-op, the imagination would be open. So the electric cooperatives, they achieved 100% electrification in the United States from 1935 to 1947. And many of these rural residents said, why can't we do the same with telephone? So this was the development of the telephone co-op sector. There's over 400 telco co-ops in the United States, and it's partially a spillover from the development of electric cooperatives. Additionally, they developed water cooperatives, they developed daycare cooperatives, additional credit unions, and these sort of things. Today, the American electric cooperative sector is comprised of over 800 distribution co-ops, again, $42 billion a year revenue, representing and owned by 42 million Americans. One of the things that's left out of the public discourse, too, is we talk about the power of rural America. We don't discuss that the electric co-ops are an example of what rural residents can do. Oftentimes people say that the electric grid is an example of one of the highest pinnacles of human engineering. But a significant portion of that in the United States was developed by rural folks. That's an amazing, empowering part of the narrative that I would like to see pulled back in to get people more charged up about what we can do in community economic development. And just to show you, here's a map of the electric co-op service territory on the left. On the right, that's just a brief diagram of how this system is structured. Mind you, there's 863 distribution electric co-ops that bring the energy to your home. But behind the scene, there's over 63 generation transmission co-ops. They own the generators. There's this extensive co-op business network that does everything from IT to mass mailing to infrastructure development. That is something that could be engaged in the development of further infrastructure in the United States. That is something that could be used for creating jobs. But again, left out of the discourse. So one of my favorite sayings in this is that we can, so we must, and this comes from Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobelist in economics from 2009. Uh, she was kind of taking on individuals that were saying that everyday folk can't come together and develop these sophisticated enterprise. She noted in her research that not only do people exhibit time and time again that when they have a need, they can work together collectively to come together and address those needs, but frequently they do it and they're successful. In this current environment where we don't have a federal government or many state governments, they're wanting to step in and help. Uh, we have to take it upon ourselves to do the difficult work of doing the public entrepreneurship. So we can, and therefore we must. But with that, we need to recognize that we have a number of resources in our own backyard. We need to stop chasing the unicorns. There is so much that's going on with regard to our public tax dollars at the local level being sent out to major corporations. What if we started to work with our community economic development groups and say, hey, let's divert at least a share of that to building local enterprise? Additionally, what if we were to leverage those monies and to work with the cooperative sector on developing new systemic approaches to advancing food cooperatives, new energy cooperatives for solar and wind? What if we were to work with credit unions in order to offer programs that got people out of poverty? Indeed, in North Carolina, the State Employee Credit Union, it's the second biggest credit union in the United States, has a payday lending program that, in essence, uses behavioral economics to trick people into saving their money. So in North Carolina, they moved 40,000 people off of payday lending and created 80 million in collective wealth. These are individuals that never saved money before. And because you have a credit union that's working with them, they're able to kind of circle that square and work around policymakers and create policy from below. So I'll leave you here with this quote from Eleanor Ostrom. There's no reason to believe that bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning, are better at solving problems than the people on the spot who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right. We're an extension. We have direct connections to these folks in the communities. We have this unique knowledge, and we could be these powerful conveners. So I would encourage us all to think deeply about these institutions of economic development, as well as these cooperatives that are in our own backyard, and to think creatively about how we can do this for a new rural renaissance. With that, I thank you very much.
Okay, Keith, thank you for that. Go ahead and take a moment, think about your questions, and type them into the chat box. Because we've got this little bit of an echo, Keith, I'm going to do the same thing with my questions, but they're going to show up from Rosa. So here's the first, if you're able to read this. Here's the Keith, did we lose you? Keith, are you still there? Rosa. Okay, Keith, if you want to go ahead and respond through your mic to answer the question, that would be that works. I just didn't want to try to read it because we've got a little bit of an echo. I apologize for the technical difficulties. It sounds like it looks like we may have a problem with Keith's mic. Um,
And can you hear me now?
yep, got you now.
All right. I apologize for that, everybody. Uh, yeah, with regard to rural industries and rural entrepreneurs, I would say a powerful partner that has not been engaged in this is the purchasing cooperative sector. There are hundreds, if not maybe about 1,500 purchasing cooperative entities around the globe that could be leveraged for small rural businesses to scale. One of the spectacular examples of this is Carpet One. Not maybe you might not know of them. Uh, Not a lot of us need to go to a carpet store unless you need to replace your carpeting every 15 years if you own a home. But Carpet One stores are independently owned, and behind the scenes, they're part of a purchasing cooperative called CCA Global. CCA Global is a $10 billion a year purchasing cooperative. Uh, they have this remarkable support system too to watch out for their entrepreneurs. When the economic crisis hit in 2007, it turns out that CCA Global had a forecasting team internally. So they were ahead of the economic crash. They reached out to their independent members and they were able to refinance terrible loans, reset old stodgy stores, and to renegotiate leases on behalf of their member stores too. In the independent flooring industry, 25% of independents went under. CCA's 2,000 plus members only had a 1% die off rate during the economic crisis. Really remarkable story. What's also great about what CCA Global is doing is just an exemplary example. They've created a number of other divisions in the home goods space. So if you go into a community and you see something like a lighting store and you wonder how it is that they're surviving in a world of Amazon, they're probably connected to CCA Global. Um, Same thing goes if you go to a rural area and you see a sporting goods store. They're probably connected to a sporting goods co-op. My understanding is that the largest one of these is headquartered out of Montana. So for me, I believe that the purchasing cooperatives could be a force multiplier for the independents and the rural entrepreneurs themselves. Thank you, Rosa.
It's like a
So I see,
couple more questions.
yeah. So I see, I'll move over to Bruce and I'll come back to Rosa. Are there examples of local co-ops being developed to save businesses and beginning members recouping their investments? Um, I believe so. So regarding the developed to save businesses, yes, there's no doubt about that. In fact, the Italian model is partially based on that. I think it was 2015 in Italy, they created a law that allows for uh, the cooperatization of either business owners wanting to retire or businesses going under. Uh, they've moved, I think it's over 300 businesses over to the cooperative sector this way. It's starting to happen more in the United States. They're doing it where they're having the workers purchase it. If you do a search online for the Isle Cooperatives in Maine, that's a wonderful example. Now, regarding members recouping on their investment, it depends on what the members are. If they're workers, by virtue of them having their jobs, then they're recouping on their investment. They actually have their income stabilized. Regarding the consumers, often when it comes to something like a food cooperative, if the consumers are giving a member loan, um, the return isn't really that big. The return is largely you're getting an interest rate on your investment, and you're also starting that enterprise. That said, these things are very good investments. Time and time again, they have been shown to pay back and pay back on time and do very well. I do want to give one more example of this, Bruce. I do know Organic Valley and Namaste Solar Co-op. These are two firms that have really gone large. They needed to get investment capital beyond just the members. So they created a preferred share offering. They were told by impact investors that these would be in demand. They didn't believe that impact investors would really want to invest this way because preferred shares allow the co-ops to create a share offering without offering any stake in governance. And we all know investors want to have a seat at the table. That said, when they did the offering, it was open, I believe, for 2 weeks, and they thought they'd have a hard time selling the offering. They sold out within 2 days. So Organic Valley has done 3 rounds of preferred share offerings. Each time it's sold out. The impact investment market really loves these. Namaste Solar Co-op, same thing. Equal Exchange is another one that's doing this, and a number of agricultural cooperatives. So yes, there are examples of saving businesses through co-ops, and yes, there are examples of recouping their investments. So while I'm waiting for another question, I see Rosa has another. Scanning the US, do you think there are some regions or states more suited to capitalize on co-ops? Or do you think there should be more industry-specific focus? That's a really fantastic question. You definitely, we do need to have public policy that supports the growth and advancement of cooperatives. I've been shocked coming out to California. Here it was, I was born and raised in the Midwest, did my education in the Midwest, saw a lot of cooperatives in the Midwest. And then I come out to progressive California, and California does not have a supportive policy environment for cooperatives. The great thing is, we do have politicians that do like cooperatives, so I don't think it's going to be difficult. But that said, it makes it hard to start these cooperatives when you don't have the policy environment. Places like Minnesota, Colorado, Wisconsin, Vermont, they have very favorable policies and regulations for the growth of cooperatives. And one of the advantages in the United States of incorporating is you can incorporate in another state. So if your state doesn't have favorable cooperative statutes, you can incorporate in another state to get those advantages. I would encourage folks to look at there's a wonderful public interest law firm out of Boulder, Colorado. It's Weiner and Associates. Jason Weiner runs it. If you want to see his work, he did a presentation with Nathan Schneider. It's on the Harvard Law website. So I'm seeing Michael has a question. He's a member of 4 cooperatives. Yep, I'm a member of REI, credit union, 2 food cooperatives, and something else myself. So I think once you drink the Kool-Aid, you do this sometimes. There are relatively few people here today for this webinar series, not surprising. Most people I know kind of have a blank look or don't know what to say when I bring up worker co-ops as an example. When I started here 19 years ago, there's a co-op specialist in U of M Applied Economics. So how do you build this idea? What are some groups, conferences to get into? That is a fantastic question. First, there are a number of folks that are trying to raise awareness of cooperatives in the public consciousness. This is a huge problem. I think first, sort of getting the basic education out there of what I just presented. Here are these amazing co-ops. They're large scale. They're highly competitive. You get that out there, and I think it's hard for people to kind of poo-poo the idea. I think then what you do is you actually get folks that are in that sector to speak at these events. I'd say one individual that's out there that's doing some wonderful things in electorate cooperatives is Adam Schwartz. He runs a consultancy called The Cooperative Way. And Adam is trying to get at least one university in every state to work with their credit unions and electric cooperatives to sponsor a cooperative class. He has that going in Virginia. He has something going in Wyoming with that right now. But if that's something that you all were interested in being connected to, then I could help with that. So there certainly is an awareness issue, Michael, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Those of us in Extension could work toward that. I see Cornelia Flores asked, can you direct us to what co-op encouraging legislation looks like? It's a very good question, Neil. There's, of all resources, one thing that kind of cracks me up with being in community economic development is how oftentimes the international development crowd and the community economic development crowd act like they're different disciplines. I see a lot of the same challenges. I don't like to think of them as completely different disciplines. But what's ironic is that there's a group called the Overseas Cooperative Development Council. They created this report called Impact. No, it's called Clarity. And Clarity is probably one of the best guidance documents on what enabling legislation for cooperatives looks like. It was developed for international development, but ironically, it is extremely relevant for U.S. economic development for cooperatives. I see Rosa's got a question. Does crowdfunding sourcing fit into the framework? What might that look like? Rosa, I absolutely believe that crowdfunding could and should be a big part of what cooperatives do. It is a great way to reinforce those bonds between the members of the cooperative and the cooperative itself. Um, Many food cooperatives, when they seek to expand, will develop a member loan program. So, Common Ground Food Cooperative in Urbana, Illinois, I was a member of the board. We did a member loan campaign that raised over $500,000. And we sought out member loans in the range of, I believe it was $10,000 to $50,000. Those have all been paid back with interest. They're very successful programs. This is how many food cooperatives grow. Unfortunately, you don't see it so much in other sectors, though there are outliers. Uh, in Oregon, there is an electric cooperative that whenever they seek to do any kind of capital investment, they do not go to the Rural Utility Service at USDA. They go to their members. I do not know exactly what it looks like, but I'm told that they raise a significant amount of their capital for growing their infrastructure through member loans. So there's absolutely an opportunity here to do the crowdsourcing and funding. I think we should take advantage of that.
Okay, well, looks like that may be it for the questions. And in the sake of time, Keith, any parting thoughts in wrapping up?
Yeah, I want to say I really appreciate everyone's interest in this topic. I think that this could be a real force multiplier for what we do in our communities around the U.S. Um, I think in this era where we sort of feel a little bit of doom and gloom, that cooperatives provide a unit for us to focus on um, that empowers us to take care of our own futures. Um, so what I would say is don't feel dejected. Re-engage. We have to get back to doing that difficult work, public entrepreneurship, and have hope because we have these institutions that are there. They're waiting for us to tap into them.
Okay, thank you for that great presentation. So again, for you in the audience, if you'd like a link to this webinar, it will be up on the NCRCRD webpage in the next couple days. So I want to say thank you again to Dr. Keith Taylor from the University of California, Davis, and also thanks to you for your participation. And with that, we will call an end to the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much.